Y'all, Wizard101 has gone through a bunch of PvP changes recently, and I always get this question: what school is best at max level for PvP? So today's video is a tier list. We're gonna be ranking all of the schools at max level PvP from worst all the way to the best, and I'm gonna try to explain it based on the way the schools play, what spells seem to be really good right now, what strategies are dominating. So without dilly-dallying any further, let's go right into number 7. I can't believe I'm saying this, but compared to the last tier list I made, there has been a complete reversal, and I'm putting depth at number 7. Now, keep in mind, the last tier list that I made was before the Drain nerf, and that is something that was overvaluing depth like crazy. Depth is still competitive, don't get me wrong, but in my opinion, not being able to drain for the values on these cards and actually draining at depth damage per pip has made it so that its actual weaknesses are way more apparent. Not only are schools that are good against weaknesses like Ice and Myth extremely favored to win against Death, there's also the balance matchup. Now, Gearhead completely counters Poison, so and if they shield in a way where you're gonna use Fire Elf, they can also echo these overtimes with Chimera. So as long as you go against a balance that's shielding every now and then, that's also a very rough matchup. What I'd say is not worked out in Death's favor even more recently is a recent change that they've done is they've basically made it so that Zilla no longer gives school-specific blades as an overtime count. If you guys are unfamiliar with the way the spell works, it can clear up to 2 overtimes, do 600 damage, but what it used to do was for each overtime cleared, it would give a 45 blade based on the school of the caster. Meaning, if a Death were to use Stormzilla before, you would get 2 45 Death blades if you cleared 2 overtime. Now, it's only Storm blades. I would argue that this makes overtimes way better, which also affects your fire matchup, also affects your life matchup. So there's a couple of things that I think Death is at the bottom for. 1, their actual counter matchups work. 2, balance is very OP. And 3, I feel like this overtime counter nerf that they did specifically affects schools that don't have natural overtime counters like Death. Kind of been the perfect catastrophe, but I do think if you were to play a ton of games, you would have the hardest time on the Death getting ranked. Now, the next school on the tier list at number 6, in my opinion, weirdly enough, is Fire. Now, here's where it was already very difficult. I would say that we're in a place where probably 5 to 6 schools are very competitive and just 1 or 2 are very powerful. So even if it's number 6 on the tier list, I would say Fire is a demon school. You could easily get the Marshal with the school. I bet Warlord is also very possible. And I do think it has a lot going for it, right? Brim is a very useful spell across the board, a very high damage spell that also makes it so you have a buff through a shield as long as you use a spell like King Art, like Elephant Spellman. And with those easy game plans, you could also throw in overtime stuff with a free elf. You could even throw in heal stuff with Barry and Link with Rain of Fire. I was very skeptical about the healing, specifically the healing part of Fire, and honestly, it does seem to function very well. Adds a layer that makes it very hard to, like, you know, like pin down. However, the reason why I would say that Fire seems to struggle a little bit more than other schools right now, and a lot of people have said that this is why. It's because when you're looking at a lot of damage up front, the most damage you could do up front on a spell right now is 820 if you max tier and a free. And why is this an issue? It's because when you go against someone that just blades and auras and traps and all of that, if they have a spell that's higher pip and that does more than 820, they have a much easier job one-shotting you than a Fire would ever have one-shotting someone else. So that affects several matchups, like Myth, which Fire is supposed to counter, but Myth has Myth Gen. All they have to do is get a triple buffed Myth Gen, and there's nothing you can do to out-trade it. You have to set up something in order to get their ass. And what specifically makes Myth, which is a school that Fire is supposed to counter, very annoying is they have Shift. Meaning, let's say they use overtimes to make up for the fact that you don't have a high damage, high pip hit. They'll just shift the damage back to you for very much, like, you know, very free. Along with that counter matchup not working, I'd say Storm and Life, which are schools that are designed to counter the overtime nature of Fire. They're very good against Fire as well. And right now, Balance is very good against Fire simply because Top Pat Scales is an explosive amount of damage for 5 pips that you simply cannot out-trade as a Fire. So you have 2 counter matchups against Fire that do work. You have 1 counter matchup on a Fire that doesn't work, as in you don't counter Myth. And you also have Balance outvaluing you with just 1 spell. That's all they need. All they have to do is throw out an aura, spam these. You can't ever do anything to keep up as a Fire. It's simply a numbers game at that point. I'd say other than Death and Ice, I don't think there's a favorable matchup for Fire, and I think that makes it pretty hard to rank up on. How could they fix this? I think they need to get rid of shift in general on Myth. I also do think if they're not going to give fire a higher pip burst hit because it's not supposed to be a burst damage school, then I find it stupid that Mythjin is an 11 pip burst hit for Myth, which is also supposed to have a lot of overtime identity. I think Myth and fire are very similar, and I think when Myth gets such higher damage hits, it does throw off the balance of the game when you're comparing it to fire. Now, if you asked me to do this tier list a few weeks ago, I would have put life up way higher than this, but right now, as it stands, I would put life in number 5. And what I'm referring to is the fairy ban in PvP. This spell used to outvalue, if you used enough of them, it used to outvalue every lower damage per pip school, even death. Even a fairy spammer against a death had a very, very high chance of winning. But with this ban, now there's only one way to heal on a life, and that's with overtimes, right? And these aren't small heals, but you do have to be careful because overtime heals can be countered. And while Stormzilla does not give school-specific blades anymore, Triton still does, which does put a massive check on overtime heals. I think very, very intentional. I would argue there are still ways to stall out a game, especially with gnomes. I've seen a lot of people do this where they go for a triple heal and then they use a gnomes, which gives you 1 extra heal per heal that you already have on yourself, which would give you 6 total heals. If you were to rebirth into a gnomes, you get 6 heals and a little bit of bonus damage. There are still ways to Jade. I'm not saying that won't happen, but because of the copy limits on overtime heals that are multiple copies anyways, eventually there's an end to it. There wasn't an end to it with Fairy, and that's why I would argue if someone packs enough heal counters, they can actually always beat a life. That is a big if, but I think that alone puts them very, very low. Heal counters work, so the healing school is going to struggle. In terms of why I think they struggle, I think Storm and Death are very, very good against life right now. Yes, you could kind of get around overtiming a Death a little bit, but it is pretty difficult stuff. I would argue, surprisingly enough, now that you can only overtime heal to recover, Ice with Snowdrift is actually very, very good against life. If they pack enough Snowdrifts and Triton, they can give you a fight for your money. I'd still say you have a gigantic upper hand against like Fire. You do definitely tend to do well against Myth, although Shield Gambits can kind of trip you up. The reason it's higher up on this tier list is, just like every other school so far on this tier list, it auto loses to balance simply because Gearhead is so good against heals and overtimes, 2 parts of what makes life. And the counter matchups are also very hard, right? You have Storm and Death, and you throw in that little Ice, you know, the weird like favorability against Ice. That's where you get number 5 on the tier list. Definitely super competitive. I'd say this is the first school on the tier list where I could think of getting to Warlord on this school pretty much just by spamming Q enough. And I'd argue that's a big progress from previous metas, where I'd say number 5 on a tier list could never think about getting to Warlord. I'd say this is the first time we're seeing the top 5 schools all be able to hit Warlord if you just spam Q like long and hard enough. Number 4 on this tier list is definitely going to be Storm. Storm has a very easy matchup against Fire and Life, as is kind of intended. That's supposed to be like their stat difference. But the reason why I'd put Storm so much above Life, even though they're very, very similar in a lot of ways, I think they just have a lot of offense that just helps them against other matchups other than their counter matchup. I think that their healing identity, even with Snowdrift, because Barry is a double heal, actually gives them a very good chance against Ice, which is supposed to counter them as a tank school. And believe it or not, even Myth, which is somewhat of a neutral matchup, is actually very approachable as long as you use Shrike, Catch of the Day, and try to kill them with the Owl. All it takes is 2 buffs and a Shrike out of a Catch of the Day, and you can kill any Myth Wizard through a shield. That's pretty powerful stuff, and the fact that you can do that against any low HP school like Storm, you can do it against Fire, you can do it against Death if you catch them slipping. This is the only school I can think of that can actually viably beat any school that they queue other than Balance. I think Balance will still beat them every time. I would say it's not higher up on the tier list because every match could also be a loss. You're very fragile as a Storm. Being number 4 is a pretty good place for Storm considering their historical placement. And I do think one of the big things that they do get just for free is an overtime, even though it's not an overtime school. When you Catch the Day and do this, set shields almost don't matter, especially when those schools don't have stuff outside of their school identity as flagrant as this. I think that's why Storm is so far up on this tier list. Now, if you had asked me a few weeks ago, I would have put Ice at number 2, but because of the Stormzilla change and how good overtimes now are against Ice, I'm gonna have to put them at number 3. Y'all, Ice is a very, very good school right now. You not only get a very, very easy matchup against both Storm and Death as long as you play solid, and by playing solid, I mean literally just keep a brace up, try to use a bunch of hit and shields, very simple stuff that any Ice could do. You also have a good combination of anti-blades and anti-auras, which is what most overtime schools use in order to buff their combos. I think the combination of these two make Fire and Myth, which are both counter matchups, somewhat approachable. The fact that Snowdrift is still a spell that's allowed in PvP also gives you a really solid anti-heal. The only matchup that you'll always probably lose is Balance. There is one exception to this, in my opinion, and that's if you run into an overtime strategy. Now that Zilla no longer gives you Ice Blades for using it, I'd say the best overtime counter for Ice is unfortunately Life King Art. This is the only counter that you could use where you could get some value out of it. Believe it or not, if you use an Earthwalker, if you use Zilla, any hanging effect that you get out of those, they're not going to give you anything that you could leverage naturally as an ice. So you have to basically just accept that and just use King Art and take the little bit of healing that you are going to get from clearing overtime. That's a pretty massive weakness, which is the only reason why I'd say both Myth and Fire and maybe even Life can really, like, you know, give you a run for your money. With old Zilla, easily Ice would have been number 2. That is right, above Myth. But for that reason alone, we're putting them at number 3. Number 2 on the tier list is going to be Myth, which is kind of a weird take for me because compared to all my other wizards, my Myth is easily the lowest ranked. For some reason, I'm 1760 on this guy, but I honestly think that's because 1, I be getting a lot of balances, especially recently, and 2, I feel like, you know, it's a very, like, you know, boring and linear playstyle that gets you rank, and I tried to avoid that just for content. That's my speculation. Maybe I'm just bad at the Myth. I don't know, but it's easily number 2. Why is that? Because right now, this is the only school that if you shield, it's a bad move, and if you weakness, it's a bad move. And very simply, all you really have to do is just blade and trap so much that your opponent has to debuff, otherwise they either die to like a base Jhin or a base Ninja Pig. And while I'm not saying it's skillless, I do think there needs to be some sort of in-game intuition as to how much your hit's gonna do, how many hits you need to kill your opponent, all that. It is very easy to cycle like just blades and traps based on your opponent and just, you know, stack up a hit. It's not really that hard. Additionally, while overtimes are supposed to counter you because you're a shielding school, you basically don't have to worry about that because of Shift. So a combination of already very broken mechanics, being able to literally ignore both weaknesses and shields, and also having stuff outside of your identity, it puts them way up on this tier list simply because you don't have to really change the way you play based on your opponent. It's very rare that you really have to change, other than maybe Life. I think against Life, you can't just blade up and go for it because they'll heal. That's basically it, though. Every other school, the game plan is simple. Just blade or trap. That's it. But yes, I think without a doubt, even given my failures with this school, I think Myth is still number 2 on this tier list. I'm gonna say this right now. I think Balance is probably the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened to Wiz, you know, in this last year, which is, you know, they've done a lot of good things, but the state of Balance right now, embarrassing. Every matchup is in your favor simply off of just a couple of spells. There's several reasons why Balance is ridiculous. One of the big reasons right now is that if you have a double school pip spell, it just does way more damage per pip than any other spell in the game, basically. They recently made it so that you can't echo shields until after the hit with the bottom pad scales, which everyone thought would be a nerf, but now everyone is just upgrading to top pad scales. And what top pad scales basically does, it outtrades every single school in the game, especially when you consider the resist that Balance gets, except for Storm. And as if pure brainless damage just given to your school for it being balanced for some reason wasn't enough, their sheer number of options just makes them completely stupid to fight. They have aura pops, so you can't aura against them, but they have so much resist that they can still brace. This is the only aura counter in the game that actually ignores the actual aura when it does what it does. So unlike other schools like Ice and Death that do have anti-auras, you can basically ignore them when they brace, but they cannot ignore your brace. They can basically use any school, so they can just put any 2-pip bubble that's not balanced in their thing, so bubbles are also bad. This one spell, which involves swapping both heals and dots for a simple 4 pips, makes an entire third of all hanging effects in the game impossible to use against Balance. And the second you go above the 1 or 2 heal overtimes or the 1 or 2 damage overtimes where, you know, swapping isn't as good, they have stuff that counters things up to 4 overtimes. And if you overheal, they even have a spell that does well over Balance CPP as well, because it's a double school pip spell. If someone has 2 heals on themselves, this spell gives you 2 blades and it gives them 2 weaknesses, all for 5 pips, just because you're a balance. School-specific weaknesses, I don't even understand what that's about. What if you blade or trap? Well, they get pips every time you blade or trap, so also that doesn't work. Balance doesn't take any drawback for being able to literally respond to anything, and their stat profile is like high res, high pierce, and high damage. It's a brain dead school. It's at the top of this tier list, not because anyone is actually good on the school, but because the school has every option under the sun, and you don't really have to think when you're doing balance PvP. I don't know what they could do. And by the way, I didn't even bring up mana burn. I guess that's the other really crazy one. You can't even get pips against a balance. I don't know what they could do to nerf balance. I think it's way too many issues all in a row. I think where I would start is I would make mana burn do damage after burning the pips. I would definitely make it so that aura pop didn't, you know, ignore the effect of a brace. I'd make it that so that 2 school pip spells don't give this much of a bonus damage wise. That's why these do damage. It's because 2 school pips is suddenly seen as so hard to get that it's worth doing this much damage. There's a lot of places they could start, and hopefully we start seeing that so every school can compete even remotely close to balance. But yes, y'all, I'm very confident about this tier list, even though some of these takes might be a little spicy. Let me know what you guys think about this tier list. Let me know if you agree with numbers 1 through 7. Where do you disagree? I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts, but I feel like a lot of people are trying to get into PvP, so hopefully I explain the interactions you'll have with all the schools at any level. I would like to say this before leaving it off. Don't be discouraged if the school that you want to PvP with is low on this tier list. I feel like if it's anything 5 or above, maybe even 6 or above, it's very competitive. You just might get a balance and not be able to play the game. That's all, you know, no biggie. As always, drop a like, let me know y'all's opinions, drop a sub if you're new, and as always, if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome, see y'all soon, and yeah.